with Mass Flight. Excellent panel. And Dan, you hit on something that forms the basis of my question, and that is the unintended consequence of small community air service. And then you said the other word which comes to mind, which is how do we engage them? How do we get allies at the grassroots through small communities who are going to be the victims in the end of this pilot shortage?
Right. I think that's great, Linda. Great to see you. When I formed this company, Flight Path Economics, about a year ago with a colleague in the back of the room, Matt Barton, and we both have been in the airline business for a while, I'd seen a lot of different aspects of the airline industry, and I'd worked in air service development for small communities and large communities in my past, and I know kind of what drove the demand for those services in those communities. And I looked at the system, the essential air service system and other sort of props to make sure that small communities had air service. And I thought, in this situation, if we truly have a lack of qualified aviators to service those small communities, which obviously are really important collectively to the country and to mainline network carriers to have feed to fly into Tokyo from San Francisco, that if you start pulling the bricks slowly away from those communities, either in diminished service or in loss of service, that it starts to have a ripple effect across the whole economy. And so the first paper we put out this spring that Matt and I did as Flight Path Economics, I wanted to shoot a flare gun off, and I wanted to say, let's pay attention to this as a country. Let's not pay attention to it as the RAA or A4A or Boeing or Embraer. Let's pay attention to it as the ramifications that are going to be much broader than the industry itself. And I liken communities today trying to attract business by saying, guess what, they just turned off our internet. We got unplugged. You still want to come here, IBM plant or Firestone factory? You want to be in Muscle Shoals, Alabama? We just lost our feeder service. Nobody's going to want that. And so this is a huge threat to small communities. And so the flare gun that I thought we would shoot off is let's take a realistic approach to see what the ramifications would be if small communities, to some extent, lost their service. To the airline industry, it's between 10 and $20 billion of revenue hit across the industry, regionals, mainline, FedEx, everybody that ships on passenger airplanes or cargo airplanes is going to have that effect. If you multiply that out to all the jobs that are attached to all these different booths around here and all these different communities and places around the world, it's $50 to $100 billion easily of economic impact. It's dispersed, it's diffused, but collectively it's a huge problem, and it's way bigger than what happened after 9/11 to this industry. Okay, so if you match that and say, is that a big enough flare to get the public's attention? I think since this spring, there's been a lot of natural traction because guess what? There actually is a pilot shortage and communities are losing air service and there isn't a simple solution. I went out to a conference last month to address some smaller communities, all sort of pulling on my coattails, chambers of commerce, people that wanted to stimulate air service, and I said, I'm sorry, by having your Chamber of Commerce guarantee a load factor or a revenue figure is not going to put a qualified pilot in the cockpit of those airplanes. And that's the problem that we face. It's different, it's structural. Paying for service is not going to solve the problem. What could happen is you have a community paying service to a carrier that serves 5 communities, and it might ordinarily change where they lose service. They might go from the next town to lose service to the 5th or 10th or 15th, but it's still going to happen. And again, we're in the bottom of the first inning here, and there's a lot of territory to cover, and we need to start reacting right now to save this air service to small communities, because the impact, while diffuse, is going to be gigantic.
Well, in order to get there, again, step one is to acknowledge you have a problem. Currently, government's confused about this issue.
We need a 12-step program.
We need an intervention, and that's why part of the RAA focus of this convention has been, and as Talinda was referring to, building that broader coalition, trying to speak as one voice, whether that is through the university and structured training inputs, whether that's from the airport perspective, who rely on passenger demand in order to create federal matching dollar grants for airport improvement projects, or the communities themselves, which Congress, for the most part, relies on to get to work generally. So I think there should be plenty of stakeholders in the mix that are going to lock arms on this. But again, and this shouldn't be referred to as an attack on the GAO or you personally, Andrew, but again, it would be more helpful if we could talk about this from a holistic perspective, as opposed to segmenting this part of the industry's fine, this part of the industry's maybe having some trouble.
Great, thanks. We talked a little bit in the first round about how big the pool is, how many pilots are out there. So let's talk for a moment about what the pool looks like. I'll start with you, Andrew. Your report noted that regional airlines are experiencing a decline in the quality of new applicants since the 1,500-hour rules took effect. So in essence, because the type of flying that they're doing is GA type, fair weather flying, and not the customized training that the airlines are providing in their own structured training programs. So can you talk a little bit about this? How serious of a concern is this?
I think it's definitely a serious concern. And this is one of those unintended consequences, right? I mean, essentially what the regulatory change created was this gap in training, right? Now you've got folks that are looking to fill those hours in whatever way they can find it, and again, those are going to be sort of low-wage jobs that they're working in a lot of cases. They're going to be finding hours however they can. They're going to be flight instructors and so on. So you're just getting further and further away from a structured environment where you're learning what it means to be an airline pilot. So I think that does create a problem. I mean, what FAA tried to do and what the ARC committee sort of suggested that they do was to give credit for a lot different kinds of training, and they did some of that and they didn't do all of it. But I mean, I think that is a real problem. The solution to that is whether FAA can sort of revisit what it's done and whether it sees a big enough issue that it can start to change sort of the pilot training parameters and qualifications that are necessary, and they do have some room to do that. But I think that's going to require, I think, as you were all alluding to, sort of a louder voice that we really need this change.
Brian, what's your take on that?
Well, I'd say two things, Faye. The 1,500-hour plus pilots have always been out there. 3 years ago, we could have hired them, but we didn't. Because when we vet pilots, we go through a number of qualitative and quantitative factors. And what we've historically found is, the pilot who's coming out of a structured training program, frankly, hasn't had time to develop a whole lot of bad habits. And then so we can take them, with several hundred hours of structured training time in an academic environment, and we can bring them, and so they have really great proficiency without any of the sort of the negative habits that you create by flying in an unstructured, single pilot environment. So very ready for the type of commercial airline training that they're going to receive from any of the regionals that are here. And so what we find now is we're looking at, we can't look at that population of pilots anymore. And so we could argue there isn't a shortage. Those pilots are still there. They're just no longer technically qualified under the statute. So we look at a different set of pilots. Last year, Republic had a demand for 500 first officers. We vetted nearly 2,400 quote on paper qualified candidates. We were able to extend employment offers to 450 of them. So that's a little, 20%-ish hit rate. Through the first 4 months of this year, we vetted over 1,000 potential candidates, and we were able to, I think the number's 88 to 90 pilots that we were actually met all of our criteria that we could extend employment offers to. So, we've gone very quickly from the sort of a 20% qualification rate, again, meeting our requirements, to 10. And we're all, as an industry, we're all looking at the same couple of thousand qualified candidates. So it's a diminishing pool. It's diminishing quickly.
Thank you. An audience question?
Thank you. Becky Ludy, University of Nebraska, Omaha Aviation Institute, and I have a problem. So, and our problem actually is recruiting of students. Not a big surprise to anyone in the room, but we're to recruit people into the aviation program, and then they have the cost of a 4-year degree. They have the added cost of $45,000 plus in flight training, which yes, you can do student loans and those kind of things. But then they're graduating out and saying, and now you have this gap to fill before you can really go out and get some of this back to start paying off the loans. So we have issues with that as well. So I guess my question really is, what do you see as solutions, and particularly what do you see the university role in solutions to these issues?
I'll take that one. First, I think we do have to come together in this broader coalition and talk, I think one-on-one with members of Congress to really let them know how this is impacting you at home. This is how folks in your district are feeling about this issue. And again, we are in the early innings on this, so right now it's manifesting itself with young men and women making career choices different than what they might have made. And so that has an implication in the here and now, but it has a much deeper, longer lasting implication, 3, 4, 5 years, because the folks that you're putting in school are the folks we're going to be relying on to operate the nation's air service 5 years from now. And if the gap coming out of your program, say they come out with 250 to 300 hours, if the gap were 200 hours, as a regional airline business, we could come up with solutions to help bridge that gap. We work with our partners in organized labor, to come up with programs that would, cadet type programs that would allow us to help them build that time. But if the gap is 1,000 hours, it's just a bridge too far. So I can understand the very difficult recruiting job you have to tell students, prospective students, that this is a great pathway. And the unfortunate thing is, it is a great career-long earning opportunity. And for all the travails and tumult of the industry over the past decade, through consolidation, through restructuring, through refleeting, the nation's global airlines have never been healthier, and the future has frankly never been brighter. And we can look at structured attrition. We saw this in 2007. Let's not forget, we saw this in 2007. And two things happened. We did a legislative change to push out age 60 to 65, bought us 5 more years, and we went into the Great Recession, which again prolonged the healing process for the nation's airlines. So who knows whether we'll find another exogenous event that will delay the process further, but it's hard to see that right now. I mean, the future for the nation's air carriers economically looks very bright, and U.S. carriers are quite vital right now.
I think one thing that I've found through a colleague probably of yours, Dr. Lovelace up at University of North Dakota, is that aspiring cadets in university and across the country, from his research, once the 1,500-hour rule became effective, a lot of his CFIs that were aspiring commercial airline pilots dropped out, left the program, did no longer want to be a pilot because that was a bridge too far. And so I think what I'm seeing, and this mixed idea that we're going to be able to solve this somehow with the shadow pilot force or by raising wages, that's not going to fix it. It's not a structural solution. So I think what's going to have to happen, and I think Brian would agree, they've been speaking about this at the board level, is a different business relationship with flight schools and a different business relationship with individual pilots that incentivizes pilots to enter the workforce without having this big debt burden to carry around, and it would help attract people to the profession. The model's out there. The foreign carriers do it.
I agree with that, Dan, but we have a longer timeline for that. So there's the here and now concern, and the RAA position is to FAA to implement the statute as Congress intended, which is essentially to adopt the ARC recommendation. And that ARC recommendation was based on subject matter experts from across the industry, including labor. So the ARC recommendation, were it to be adopted tomorrow, would provide the temporary relief that we need to build a structured future.
I think what Brian's talking about is the pipeline from graduation to a job. And what I was talking about really is the business relationship that's the obstacle to people entering the profession. And I think, in the talks that I've given about this, there is a separation. There's a business solution that involves carrier sponsorship in the longer term and a sort of a lock-in on training costs and expenses to keep those people in the cockpit for a certain number of years or a certain number of hours. The other part of it is, what Brian was addressing, is the pipeline issue. The ARC recommendations are different than the law today. And I think both of those have to work in order to make the system work. And it requires a different way to think about our pilot growing process and our pruning of pilots. I was just, interestingly enough, I was just in a mediation in Dallas yesterday, and the guy who was mediating it, Jim McKenzie, was a Northwest 747 pilot, retired, and I said to him, Jim, you know, were you safe at 200, 300 hours? He goes, look, I was landing on carrier decks with a high-speed jet at 120 hours. And so the concept of pilots who know this, the 1,500-hour rule, does not relate to competency in any way. In fact, the subject matter experts that testified before Congress years ago said that there was no relationship between quantity and quality. And it's the exact thing Brian was talking about, bad habits. In fact, people with 500 hours were more proficient in the cockpit than people with 1,200 or 1,500 hours. And so this relationship of hours is sort of a knee-jerk reaction based on the Buffalo incident. I think we have to focus our energy on fixing that, because it relates back to the classroom problem that you've got, is who's going to be interested in being a pilot. Now that there's hiring, you face this years-long, $150,000 obstacle that's in their way. That has to be changed. So.
Take another audience question.